June 24, 1941. The desert wind carried the sound of distant engines across the dunes. Behind the British lines, a group of mechanics gathered around a captured German armoured car, its angular hull gleaming under the North African sun. The machine looked formidable, its sloped armour catching the light like the facets of a jewel. Yet the men who surrounded it weren't admiring the design. They were preparing to test it. A corporal raised a Lee Enfield rifle, chambered around, and aimed at the side of the vehicle. The others stepped back, covering their ears. A sharp crack echoed through the air. When the dust settled, every head turned toward the spot where the bullet had struck. There was a hole. A clean puncture through the armour, light shining straight through to the other side. The men stared in disbelief. The steel that was supposed to protect German crews had just failed against an ordinary rifle. That single shot revealed a secret no propaganda could hide. The Sd.Kfz 222, Germany's standard light reconnaissance vehicle, was not the invincible scout it had been made out to be. Beneath its sharp, futuristic design lay just 8 millimeters of steel. Armour so thin that even a determined rifleman could challenge it. The discovery raised a question that echoed across the desert. How could one of the most advanced armies in the world send its crews into battle in a vehicle that couldn't even resist basic rifle fire? To understand the answer, one has to go back nearly a decade, to the time when Germany was still forbidden from building tanks. The Treaty of Versailles had left the nation's military planners with their hands tied. They were prohibited from designing or manufacturing heavy armoured vehicles. But the treaty said nothing about armoured cars. And in that single omission, German engineers saw opportunity. If they couldn't build tanks, they would build something that came close. The early 1930s saw a quiet renaissance in German vehicle design. Civilian companies like Hawk and Daimler-Benz began producing multi-purpose chassis that could be adapted for military use. Engineers worked under the guise of police development projects, creating machines that would one day become the backbone of a rearmed Wehrmacht. Out of this shadow industry emerged a vision, a fast, agile, lightly protected vehicle capable of racing ahead of the main forces, scouting enemy positions, and relaying vital information. The goal wasn't to fight, but to see without being seen, to know what lay ahead before the rest of the army arrived. The result was the Sd.Kfz 222, a sleek, 8-wheeled symbol of German ingenuity and ambition. Its appearance alone inspired confidence. Angular armor plates arranged in a diamond-shaped hull gave it a modern, almost futuristic silhouette. An open-top turret housed a 20mm automatic cannon, complemented by a coaxial machine gun for defense against infantry. With its powerful V8 engine, it could reach speeds of up to 80 km per hour, astonishing for its time. On the roads of Europe, the 222 seemed to glide like a predatory cat, fast, graceful, and silent. To its crews, it represented progress. They were told it could shrug off small arms fire and withstand battlefield shrapnel. Training manuals praised its mobility and firepower, promising safety through speed and design. In the mid-1930s, that seemed true enough. Few nations possessed the kind of armor-piercing ammunition that would later become standard. The 222's angled plates could deflect most bullets at a distance, and its rapid acceleration allowed quick retreats when heavier weapons appeared. What the crews didn't realize was that this balance, speed over protection, was a gamble. One that only worked as long as their enemies lacked the tools to exploit its weakness. But the world was changing fast. The weapons that had been rare in 1938 would be common by 1941. And when those weapons met the thin armor of the Sd.Kfz 222, the results would be devastating. Yet, for now, in the mid-1930s, everything seemed to be going Germany's way. As the country secretly rearmed, engineers refined their designs year after year. The Hawk chassis offered remarkable off-road agility thanks to its four-wheel drive and, in some variants, four-wheel steering. This allowed the vehicle to turn sharply in narrow spaces, a critical advantage for reconnaissance in tight European villages or forest paths. Each part of the vehicle reflected precision craftsmanship. Welds were neat, bolts aligned perfectly, and the suspension provided a surprisingly smooth ride. Crews could take it over rough terrain and still maintain communication and visibility, crucial for reconnaissance missions. The open-top turret allowed commanders to observe from all directions, while a wire mesh cover protected them from grenades thrown from above. The philosophy behind the design was simple. A scout should move quickly, report accurately, and never get caught in a prolonged firefight. The armor was never meant to stop anti-tank rounds. It was meant to buy enough time to escape. In theory, this approach made sense. But in practice, war rarely followed theory. The 222's armor thickness, 8 mm on the sides, 5 on the bottom and rear, was just enough to stop pistol rounds or deflect the occasional glancing hit from a distant rifle. The front received modest reinforcement in later versions, reaching up to 14.5 mm. But the side protection, where the vehicle was most vulnerable, remained thin. For an engineer sitting in a Berlin design office, that was an acceptable compromise. For the crews who would later drive into the chaos of North Africa, it would be the difference between life and loss. By 1938, the Sd.Kfz 222 was officially entering production. It became one of the most recognizable symbols of early German mechanization, a sleek machine that looked as fast as it was. In propaganda reels, it darted through mock villages and across muddy fields, the voiceover praising its impenetrable armor and unstoppable speed. German soldiers watching these films believed it. And why wouldn't they? The vehicle had never truly been tested against modern ammunition. That test would come soon enough, in the open deserts of Libya, where there was nowhere to hide, no trees to cover a retreat, and no illusions strong enough to stop a bullet. The first time the Sd.Kfz 222 saw real combat, it performed exactly as its designers had hoped. In September 1939, during the invasion of Poland, the little armored car roared down dusty rural roads ahead of the main panzer columns. Polish forces, still relying on outdated rifles and light anti-tank weapons, were unprepared for Germany's new lightning style of warfare. The 222, fast and nimble, became the perfect scout. Its crews raced through villages, bypassed enemy lines, and reported back positions with speed that astonished senior officers. German propaganda celebrated the vehicle as a triumph of modern engineering. Newspapers published photos of the 222 splashing through rivers, its sharp profile cutting through smoke and dust. For the soldiers inside, these images weren't exaggerations, they reflected their own experience. In Poland, the vehicle did everything it was supposed to do. It gathered intelligence, avoided direct combat, and returned safely. No one questioned its armor because it was never truly tested. When the war expanded into France the following year, the Sd.Kfz 222 again played a starring role. French and British forces possessed stronger tanks and heavier guns, but they struggled to adapt to the speed of German operations. The 222's agility allowed it to weave through traffic jams of retreating units and locate weak points in enemy lines. The vehicles often operated in pairs, one scouting while the other provided covering fire. In the rapid advance to the Channel, they became the eyes of the panzer divisions. To the German soldiers driving them, the 222 felt like a reliable companion, quick, powerful, and trustworthy. Crews began to personalize their vehicles with painted emblems or small modifications, a sign of attachment that spoke to confidence in the machine. They believed the sloped armor truly protected them, that its angular shape could deflect anything short of a cannon shell. The battlefield seemed to confirm this belief. France fell in 6 weeks. Once again, the 222 appeared invincible. But those victories carried a dangerous illusion. The vehicle's success depended on opponents who were poorly positioned, disorganized, or unequipped with armor-piercing ammunition. Against such enemies, the 222's thin plating didn't matter. It was fast enough to avoid most threats. Yet this would not hold true forever. By early 1941, the 222 had already fought in 3 major campaigns: Poland, France, and the Balkans. Each had reinforced the same comforting narrative: speed was safety. German reconnaissance doctrine revolved around the idea that scouts should observe, not fight. As long as the 222 avoided getting pinned down, its armor was adequate. The problem was that combat rarely followed doctrine. Then came Africa. In February 1941, the first units of the newly formed Afrika Korps arrived in Libya. Their task was to rescue Italy's faltering campaign and push back British forces. Leading the German deployment was the 5th Light Division, soon to become the 21st Panzer Division. Among their vehicles were dozens of Sd.Kfz 222s, freshly repainted in desert camouflage and equipped with extra water canisters strapped to their hulls. The North African desert presented challenges no German crew had experienced before. The temperature soared past 50 degrees by day and dropped close to freezing at night. Fine sand crept into every mechanical part, wearing down engines and clogging filters. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of open terrain. But the desert also offered one major advantage: visibility. From the turret of a 222, a commander could see for miles in every direction. Reconnaissance crews could spot dust trails long before the enemy came into view. For the first few months, the 222 thrived in this environment. Its speed made it ideal for the vast open spaces. It could dart across dunes, flank enemy convoys, and retreat before being targeted. German reconnaissance patrols, often composed of several armored cars supported by motorcyclists, pushed deep behind British lines. They located fuel dumps, ambush points, and forward camps, sending back reports that helped Rommel plan his famous counterattacks. British forces, at first, were caught off guard. They admired the engineering of captured 222s, calling them crafty little machines. The open desert turned into a deadly chessboard where each side's scouts raced to outmaneuver the other. For a time, the German reconnaissance teams seemed unbeatable. But the desert was also an unforgiving teacher. Every design flaw, every miscalculation, eventually revealed itself under its blazing sun. The same open terrain that made the 222 so effective as a scout also stripped away its main defense, cover. In Europe, a vehicle could hide behind buildings or trees. In North Africa, it could only rely on speed and the hope that no one aimed too accurately. And soon, someone did. British infantry units had been re-equipped with specialized armor-piercing ammunition, small, hardened steel core bullets designed to defeat light armor. These rounds were originally developed for emergency use against enemy vehicles. Now they found a perfect target in the German reconnaissance cars. The first reports of penetrations began to circulate quietly. Patrols that had encountered light rifle fire returned with unexpected holes in their hulls. Mechanics patched them and assumed bad luck or unusually close shots. But as the encounters grew more frequent, a pattern emerged. The armor wasn't failing because of poor maintenance. It was simply too thin. By mid-1941, as Rommel's advance slowed and battles stretched across longer distances, British troops began recovering abandoned German vehicles. Some had run out of fuel, others had broken down or been left behind during retreats. Among them were several Sd.Kfz 222s, intact enough for examination. The British engineers who inspected them were impressed by the quality of workmanship, the precise welds, the reliable engines, but puzzled by the thinness of the armor. To confirm their suspicions, they decided to conduct field tests behind the lines. What followed would strip away the myth of German invincibility and reveal just how fragile that confidence had been. The tests began casually, almost as a curiosity. A few mechanics, some infantrymen, and a captured vehicle sitting quietly in the desert heat. They fired pistols first, then submachine guns. The armor held, as expected. Then came the rifles. One shot, one neat hole, and a moment of stunned silence. The revelation would travel from that lonely patch of desert all the way to command desks in London. And for the crews still driving Sd.Kfz 222s across the sand, it meant the beginning of a slow and painful realization. Their trusted steel guardian wasn't nearly as protective as they had been led to believe. The testing site sat in the middle of nowhere, a stretch of hard, sun-baked desert surrounded by nothing but sand and silence. A small group of British mechanics, engineers, and infantrymen gathered around the captured Sd.Kfz 222. Its beige paint was still dusty from the battlefield, its tires half buried in the sand. The vehicle looked almost untouched, as if it might start up and drive away at any moment. The men didn't expect anything extraordinary. They were simply curious. What was this German machine made of? How tough was it really? They began methodically. First, the pistols. Standard Webley revolvers firing soft 9mm rounds. The bullets flattened harmlessly against the sloped steel. Someone laughed. The armor, at least, could stop a handgun. Then came the submachine guns, the British Sten and the American Thompson, both firing the same 9mm cartridges. A few dents appeared, some paint chipped, but nothing serious. So far, the vehicle lived up to expectations. Then a corporal brought out his rifle, a Lee Enfield chambered for the .303 British cartridge. It was the standard rifle of the British infantry, accurate, dependable, and known for its power. The mechanic in charge of the test nodded. "Let's see what this one does." The corporal aimed at the side plate, where the armor was flat and perpendicular. A single shot echoed through the air. When the dust settled, a small, perfectly round hole stared back at them. The bullet had gone straight through. No one spoke for a moment. One of the engineers walked up to the vehicle, ran his fingers along the entry point, then peered inside. On the opposite wall, there was an exit hole, jagged and torn outward. He turned back to the others. Straight through, he said quietly. They fired again, same result. Different angles, different distances. The conclusion was always the same. The 8mm armor, so confidently advertised by German propaganda as proof against rifle fire, had just failed its most basic test. Against armor-piercing ammunition, it offered no protection at all. Word of the discovery spread quickly among the mechanics. The British didn't have to rely on heavy anti-tank guns or artillery to deal with these vehicles anymore. A well-trained rifleman with the right ammunition could handle it. The tests continued for days. The mechanics recorded every result carefully, measuring hole diameters, testing angles, and noting effective ranges. The standard armor-piercing .303 round could pierce the side armor at over 100 meters. The bottom and rear, only 5mm thick, were even weaker. One sergeant, formerly a car body worker before the war, shook his head and said, "I've seen delivery vans with thicker panels than this." Behind the lines, officers began compiling the data. Reports were sent to intelligence units and training schools. Field manuals were quietly updated with new instructions. If engaged by German armored cars of the Sd.Kfz 222 type, aim for the side hull. Standard rifles with armor-piercing ammunition are sufficient. It wasn't just a technical note, it was a morale boost. Infantrymen who had once feared the sight of those fast-moving German scouts now realized they had a chance. As word spread, British and Commonwealth forces across the desert began testing for themselves. Some units held informal demonstrations, showing riflemen how their bullets could punch through the supposedly invincible armor. These impromptu lessons traveled from platoon to platoon until the 222's weakness became common knowledge. Meanwhile, back on the German side, crews had no idea that their secret had been uncovered. They continued to drive confidently into patrols, unaware that the British rifles now posed a real danger. When losses occurred, they were often blamed on luck or misfortune, never on the armor itself. After all, German manuals assured them their vehicles could resist rifle fire. But as months passed, the illusion began to crumble. In after-action reports from North Africa, German commanders noted increasing cases of unexpected penetrations. Crews were returning shaken, describing rounds that punched through side plates that should have held. Some reports were dismissed as exaggeration, others as isolated incidents. It took time for the truth to reach higher command, that the very foundation of the reconnaissance fleet was flawed. At the same time, the British School of Tank Technology in Chertsey, England, received several captured vehicles for detailed examination. These weren't quick field tests, they were full evaluations, measuring everything from engine performance to armor composition. When technicians in Surrey confirmed the same results, 8mm of mild-rolled steel, easily penetrated by rifle fire, the discovery became official. Reports circulated through the War Office, and eventually through Allied intelligence networks. The findings shocked even seasoned analysts. The German 222, so prominent in films and propaganda, was no more resistant than a lightly plated truck. To make matters worse, its open-top turret left the crew exposed to grenades, air bursts, and debris. The armor wasn't just thin, it was incomplete protection. The lesson was clear. German engineering, while sophisticated, had made a calculated choice. Speed and agility had been prioritized over crew safety. The 222 wasn't meant to fight, it was meant to see and escape. But in the real desert war, where lines blurred and engagements happened without warning, escape was often impossible. As the summer of 1941 turned into autumn, British intelligence prepared a series of briefing notes for officers in the 8th Army. The documents included diagrams of the Sd.Kfz 222, clearly labeling weak points, side, 8mm, vulnerable to .303 armor piercing at 100 yards. Rear, 5mm, vulnerable at all practical ranges. Soldiers were encouraged to concentrate fire, aiming at flat surfaces rather than sloped ones. This simple knowledge transformed encounters in the field. The next time a patrol spotted one of the German armored cars approaching, they didn't panic. Instead, they took positions, aimed carefully, and waited. The vehicle's speed was still impressive, but speed could no longer compensate for fragility. The desert, once a showcase for German confidence, had exposed its weakness with brutal clarity. What began as a casual test in the sand had become a tactical revelation, one that would ripple through every Allied unit from Egypt to Tunisia. And back in Germany, engineers were already beginning to sense that something had gone very wrong with their once celebrated reconnaissance vehicle. Inside Germany's armored vehicle design offices, The news from North Africa arrived quietly, disguised in technical memos and engineering reports. No dramatic announcements, no newspaper headlines, just a growing realization among those who built the Sd.Kfz 222 that their creation, so admired for its elegance and agility, had a fatal flaw. The reports from the field were short but alarming. Armor penetration by rifle fire at close range. Side plates vulnerable. Crew casualties despite avoidance of heavy weapons. At first, engineers at the Hawk and Auto Union factories refused to believe it. The data couldn't be right. The 222 had been built to precise specifications. The armor was sloped, hardened, and tested in trials before production. But those trials had been conducted in Germany, using German ammunition at controlled distances and angles. Real combat didn't follow laboratory rules. Bullets didn't always hit at 45 degrees, and soldiers didn't always shoot from far away. German doctrine was partly to blame. Reconnaissance vehicles were never meant to fight their way through danger. They were meant to avoid it. Commanders were taught to use speed and distance as protection. The problem was that by 1941, battlefields no longer allowed for clean separations between scouting and fighting. Every front was fluid, every encounter unpredictable. A recon patrol could be advancing one moment and ambush the next. When the Afrika Korps began sending back detailed technical feedback, the reality could no longer be ignored. Reports described instances where crews had been injured inside their vehicles despite minimal damage outside. The culprit was spalling, tiny fragments of steel that broke off the inside of the armor when struck by bullets, turning the vehicle's interior into a shower of metal splinters. Even when rounds didn't fully penetrate, they could still wound the crew. German engineers tried to respond. By late 1939, new production batches featured slightly thicker front plates, up to 14.5 millimeters, but the sides remained unchanged. The rationale was simple. Increasing the armor everywhere would make the vehicle heavier, slower, and more expensive. The Sd.Kfz 222's biggest advantage was its mobility. Lose that, and it would no longer fit its purpose. The Army wanted fast scouts, not miniature tanks. But as the war spread and Allied weapons improved, this trade-off grew harder to justify. In the Soviet Union, where fighting erupted just weeks after those desert tests, the same weakness appeared again. Soviet soldiers with armor-piercing rifle rounds, 7.62mm B-32 ammunition, reported they could damage German reconnaissance cars with direct hits. Even the older Sd.Kfz 221s and 223s, built on the same chassis, suffered identical problems. What had begun as an isolated technical issue was now a systemic one. Meanwhile, in London, the British intelligence departments were piecing together a broader picture of the German armoured car fleet. The captured 222s sent back to the School of Tank Technology were examined in meticulous detail. Engineers stripped them apart, studying their welds, engines, and armour composition. They praised the craftsmanship. The Hawk V8 engine ran smoothly even after long use, but confirmed what field tests had shown. The side armour could be pierced by rifle fire from 150 meters, sometimes even farther. These findings weren't just technical curiosities. They shaped battlefield tactics. Allied commanders began incorporating the 222's vulnerabilities into training programs. Infantry were taught to aim for flat surfaces, while armoured car crews learned to exploit the vehicle's agility by keeping their distance. British anti-tank manuals noted that the 222's open-top turret made it especially susceptible to air bursts and grenade fragments, recommending that troops target it with indirect fire or suppressive attacks. As British and Commonwealth forces adapted, the German reconnaissance advantage began to fade. What had once been an intimidating presence on the battlefield was becoming a liability. Crews started driving more cautiously, avoiding open spaces, and relying on cover whenever possible. The sleek, angular silhouette that had symbolized speed now stood out as an easy target against the monotone desert. By early 1942, the Germans recognized that their light armored cars were reaching the limits of their usefulness. The Wehrmacht began exploring replacements, experimenting with heavier 8-wheel designs like the Sd.Kfz 234 Puma. But mass production would take time, and in war, time was a luxury Germany no longer had. The 222 continued to serve, not because it was ideal, but because it was available. Still, even as it fell behind technically, it remained a well-engineered machine. Its steering system, allowing all 4 wheels to turn, gave it unmatched maneuverability. Crews could reverse out of ambushes with astonishing speed, a life-saving feature in tight corners or city streets. The open turret, though dangerous, provided excellent visibility, allowing commanders to spot threats faster than enclosed vehicles. These strengths kept the 222 relevant, at least for a while. But back in the desert, reality was catching up fast. Every Allied patrol that captured another 222 added to the growing database of German weaknesses. Reports circulated across Commonwealth forces, from the British 8th Army to Australian and New Zealand units, explaining how to engage and disable the vehicle. Instructors demonstrated how a few well-placed shots from armor-piercing rifles could disable the car or neutralize its gunner. Soldiers practiced until it became second nature. The shift in perception was profound. Where the Sd.Kfz 222 had once inspired caution, it now provoked opportunity. To Allied infantrymen, it wasn't an unstoppable machine anymore. It was a challenge that could be met with skill and precision. And for the first time, German crews began to feel something they weren't used to in 1941, doubt. That doubt followed them across every front where the 222 served. In the forests of Russia, in the rocky passes of Greece, and in the endless dunes of North Africa, the same truth emerged. The thin, elegant armor that once symbolized speed now symbolized vulnerability. The vehicle's design philosophy, speed over safety, had run headfirst into the brutal logic of modern warfare. As engineers in Germany continued to modify and experiment, a new question haunted their work. Could a reconnaissance vehicle ever truly be both fast and safe? Or was every extra millimeter of armor just another trade-off waiting to cost a life in the field? By the spring of 1942, the intelligence about the Sd.Kfz 222's vulnerability had fully integrated into Allied field operations. What had begun as quiet mechanical experiments in the desert now shaped real tactics on the battlefield. British and Commonwealth units, once cautious at the sight of those fast-moving German armored cars, began treating them as targets of opportunity rather than threats. Infantry patrols were issued small quantities of armor-piercing rifle ammunition and instructed on where to aim. Fire at the sides, the manual said. Never at the sloped front. Wait until the vehicle turns or presents a broadside. Soldiers were trained to fire in short, precise bursts, controlled shots at close range instead of panic volleys. A well-aimed round through the thin side armor could stop a 222 instantly. For the first time in the Desert War, the German reconnaissance advantage was beginning to slip. The Sd.Kfz 222 had been designed to move ahead of the main forces, to spot enemy formations and guide the armored divisions. But now, those same reconnaissance patrols hesitated to approach too closely. Their once daring scouting missions became more conservative, their reports less detailed. Fear, subtle but growing, crept into the minds of the crews. Rommel's staff soon noticed a decline in the accuracy of field intelligence. Reconnaissance units, which had previously driven confidently deep into enemy lines, now preferred to observe from afar. Commanders couldn't blame them. The crews knew that one well-placed rifle round could pierce their side armor, and there was no replacement vehicle in sufficient numbers to take the 222's place. Meanwhile, the British were turning captured 222s to their own advantage. Engineers at Chertsey used them to train new gunners, showing how even basic weapons could defeat lightly armored targets. Instructors would point out the thin side panels and tell recruits, "Remember this silhouette, this is not invincible. You can beat it." That psychological shift, removing the aura of German technological superiority, was as powerful as any weapon. Out in the desert, where every encounter was a matter of seconds, knowledge became survival. Allied troops learned to exploit the 222's biggest weaknesses, its limited fuel range, its exposure from above, and its vulnerability when stationary. When patrols spotted one, they aimed for the flanks, trying to disable its tires or engine compartment. Others would circle around and attack from behind, where the armor was only 5 mm thick. Even small-caliber machine guns, when fired in sustained bursts, could damage critical components. The Germans, realizing how quickly their opponents were adapting, began modifying their tactics. Reconnaissance patrols now traveled in mixed formations, Sd.Kfz 222s accompanied by half-tracks or heavier armored cars. They operated in short bursts, relying on surprise and mobility rather than prolonged observation. Orders emphasized avoiding prolonged exposure, keeping distance from enemy lines, and never engaging infantry unless absolutely necessary. To compensate for their vulnerabilities, crews began improvising. Some added spare track links or sandbags to the sides of their vehicles, hoping to reinforce the armor. Others carried extra fuel cans strapped along the hull, though this often proved more dangerous than protective. In the open desert, every ounce of added weight reduced speed, and speed was their only real defense. German engineers tried to fix the issue at its root. Production lines adjusted, and newer 222 variants rolled out with thicker frontal armor, up to 30 mm on some models. These later versions could withstand rifle fire from the front, but the sides remained unchanged. Manufacturing stronger plates for the entire hull would have required a heavier engine, redesigned suspension, and new components, none of which could be produced quickly in wartime Germany. The compromise was inevitable: improve the front, accept the risk on the sides. For the crews, this meant one thing: never turn broadside to the enemy. Training manuals began to emphasize maneuvering tactics that kept the front angled toward potential threats, using the sloped armor to deflect incoming fire. But in the chaos of battle, perfect positioning was rarely possible. A single mistake, an exposed turn, a stalled engine, or a flat tire could mean disaster. By late 1942, the Allies had incorporated these lessons into nearly every level of training. British manuals circulated diagrams showing weak points not only on the Sd.Kfz 222 but also on other German armoured cars. Units practiced identifying silhouettes at long distances, learning to distinguish between different variants and prioritize their shots. Intelligence officers briefed entire divisions on the vulnerabilities of German reconnaissance vehicles before operations began. This systematic approach paid off. During engagements like the Second Battle of El Alamein, British infantry and tank crews applied their knowledge decisively. Reconnaissance vehicles that once scouted fearlessly ahead of Rommel's divisions now found themselves picked off at long range or ambushed from cover. What had been an advantage in 1941 turned into a liability by the end of 1942. Even so, the Sd.Kfz 222 remained in widespread service simply because it was too valuable to retire. Germany's war machine, stretched across multiple fronts, couldn't afford to replace every outdated vehicle. On the Eastern Front, 222s still roamed the vast plains, their speed useful for scouting in open terrain. In occupied Europe, they patrolled roads, escorted convoys, and guarded supply lines. But wherever they went, the lesson of North Africa followed them. Their armor was only an illusion of safety. To the men who drove them, this knowledge created a strange tension. They loved the machine's agility, its quick response, its roar across open ground. But every bump, every echo of gunfire reminded them that beneath their feet lay only a few millimeters of steel that could no longer promise protection. The Allies, on the other hand, treated each captured vehicle as a valuable teacher. Instructors would walk new recruits around one, pointing at the thin panels and explaining where to shoot. This, they'd say, tapping the slope side, is what overconfidence looks like. Learn from it. And that, perhaps, was the real story of the Sd.Kfz 222, not just a machine built for speed, but a symbol of the dangerous balance between innovation and oversight. Its sleek shape had once represented the future of German warfare. Now, it represented the cost of believing that speed could replace safety. When the first Sd.Kfz 222s fell into Soviet hands during the summer of 1941, they caused genuine curiosity among Red Army engineers. The Germans had invaded with a mix of speed and precision the Soviets had never encountered. Their armored columns moved with breathtaking coordination: tanks, half-tracks, motorcycles, and, leading the way, small armored cars like the 222. When one was captured relatively intact near Smolensk, Soviet specialists immediately sent it to Moscow for analysis. Inside a hangar at the Kubinka testing range, technicians disassembled the vehicle piece by piece. They admired the compact Hawk V8 engine, the efficient transmission system, and the elegant design of the suspension. Soviet engineers, used to heavier, simpler vehicles like the BA-10, found the 222's mechanical precision impressive. But when they examined its armor, their admiration turned to disbelief. The steel plates were thin, no more than 8 mm on the sides, 5 on the rear. "This is a reconnaissance car, not a tank," one engineer remarked. Yet even as a scout, it seemed underprotected. To confirm, they fired their standard 7.62 mm armor-piercing B-32 rounds at the hull. The bullets sliced through effortlessly. The results were documented, summarized, and passed to the Red Army's Design Bureau with a single note: "The vehicle is fast, but fragile." From that moment, the Soviets understood something crucial about German doctrine. The Wehrmacht's philosophy relied on tempo, fast, synchronized movement that compensated for individual weakness. Their reconnaissance vehicles weren't built to fight, They were built to see and report. That insight helped the Red Army adapt its own approach. Soviet designers focused on heavier armored cars like the BA-64, sacrificing some speed for greater protection. It was slower, less graceful, but survivable, a reflection of Soviet priorities: simplicity, strength, and endurance. Across the ocean, the Americans were reaching similar conclusions. By 1943, the US Army had captured several Sd.Kfz 222s in North Africa and shipped them to Aberdeen Proving Ground for examination. The tests followed a familiar pattern: measure, disassemble, fire, and record. The Aberdeen report described the vehicle as an interesting but overly specialized design. The testers admired its smooth handling and all-wheel drive, noting that it handles off-road terrain better than most Allied cars. But the verdict on protection was blunt: armor inadequate for reconnaissance operations in modern combat. The Americans learned from what they saw. Their own M8 Greyhound armored car, developed around the same period, carried 19 mm of frontal armor, more than twice that of the 222, and a closed turret that offered full crew protection. It wasn't as nimble, but it was survivable. Where the Germans had chosen speed, the Americans chose balance. The M8 wasn't as sleek, but it could stay in the fight longer. This quiet exchange of lessons, learned not through dialogue, but through captured machines, was one of the war's hidden dialogues. Every nation studied its enemy's designs, taking what worked and rejecting what didn't. In that sense, the Sd.Kfz 222 became a global teacher. Its strengths shaped new engineering standards. Its flaws warned designers what to avoid. By 1943, the 222's presence was everywhere, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the forests of Italy. German reconnaissance units still relied on it heavily, though now with growing frustration. Against partisans and ambushes, its open top was a liability. In the east, even small-caliber machine guns could damage its hull. Some crews improvised shields made from spare tracks or sheets of scrap metal welded over the turret rim. Others carried additional sandbags or even logs on the sides. These crude solutions showed the soldiers' resourcefulness and their lack of faith in the armor's promise. Meanwhile, Allied propaganda quietly capitalized on the vehicle's shortcomings. Newsreels showed footage of captured Sd.Kfz 222s lined up for inspection, with commentary emphasizing how the once-feared German scout car now stands exposed as lightly built and easily disabled. The implication was clear. The myth of German invincibility was breaking down. For soldiers on both sides, this message carried weight. Confidence and fear often decided as much in battle as armor or ammunition. Still, one couldn't dismiss the 222's strengths. Its suspension system was years ahead of its time, allowing remarkable agility on broken terrain. It could ford shallow rivers, cross soft sand, and climb steep grades without losing traction. Its steering was responsive, and its engine surprisingly reliable under harsh conditions. In pure design terms, it was a masterpiece of mechanical efficiency, just misapplied. The flaw wasn't in how it was built, but in what it was expected to endure. Even as it aged, the 222 continued to evolve. German engineers introduced the ORSF C variant with a more powerful engine and improved armor layout. Later versions mounted a 20mm kilowatt K38 autocannon with higher rate of fire, allowing the car to engage light vehicles and aircraft. These upgrades extended its usefulness, especially in reconnaissance roles across occupied Europe, where the risk of heavy fire was lower. But in frontline combat, its time was running out. In the final years of the war, as Germany's resources dwindled, the Sd.Kfz 222 became a symbol of both ingenuity and desperation. It was still fast, still capable, but hopelessly outmatched. The modern battlefield had moved on, filled with heavier weapons, air power, and mechanized infantry. The light armored car that once defined blitzkrieg was now outdated, a relic of an earlier phase of warfare. When the war ended, surviving examples of the 222 found their way into museums, scrapyards, and private collections. Engineers from every side continued to study them long after the fighting stopped. In a way, the vehicle had achieved what it was always meant to do. It had shown the world what was coming next. For every flaw revealed in the desert or the snow, there was also a lesson. The 222 taught the Allies how to fight faster and smarter. It taught the Germans how thin the line was between speed and safety. And for future generations of designers, it offered a lasting truth. Engineering brilliance means nothing if it forgets the human inside the machine. By late 1944, the The once proud Sd.Kfz 222 was no longer the spearhead of German reconnaissance. It was the survivor of a vanished era. The same vehicle that had led lightning advances across Europe now found itself in retreat, traversing the same roads it once conquered. Its elegant frame, designed for open desert and sweeping plains, was now coated with the mud of retreating columns and the grey dust of bombed-out villages. The German army's priorities had changed. Production was focused on tanks, anti-aircraft weapons, and the new generation of 8-wheeled armoured cars like the Sd.Kfz 234. The 222, once considered advanced, was increasingly relegated to secondary roles, liaison duties, convoy escorts, or rear area patrols. Yet, despite its age and thin armour, it refused to disappear. It remained reliable, easy to repair, and fast enough to escape trouble when luck allowed. For many German soldiers, especially those assigned to reconnaissance battalions, the 222 became something deeply personal, a companion that had shared every victory and hardship. They gave their vehicles names, painted small emblems on the side panels, and treated them with a kind of mechanical affection. One veteran would later describe his 222 as a comrade made of steel, brave but delicate. It was a machine that asked for care and rewarded it with loyalty. But as Allied air superiority grew overwhelming, even the best-maintained 222s had little chance. Open-top turrets made them vulnerable to aircraft strafing, and their thin armour could not withstand the hail of .50 caliber rounds raining from the skies. The same M2 Browning that had first proven its power in North Africa was now everywhere, mounted on jeeps, trucks, tanks, and aircraft. German crews often spoke of the distinct hammering sound of American heavy machine gun fire, knowing that their light armour offered little comfort against it. In France, after the Normandy landings, the Sd.Kfz 222's role changed once more. German forces were now on the defensive, operating in terrain full of ambushes, narrow roads, and villages turned into strongpoints. The 222's speed was of limited use here. What mattered was survivability, and that was never its strength. Nevertheless, German commanders continued to deploy it because there was no better option left in sufficient numbers. In reconnaissance, as in much of the German war effort by that stage, necessity had replaced strategy. Soldiers learned to adapt. They used the 222 as a mobile observation post, hiding behind buildings or tree lines while the gunner scanned the horizon through binoculars. They often drove without the turret gun elevated, keeping their profile low to avoid detection. In winter, crews stuffed rags into the open turret gaps to keep the cold out. Sometimes, they replaced the 20mm autocannon with a mg.34 or mg.42, saving precious ammunition and reducing weight. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In Eastern Europe, the story was even harsher. As the Red Army advanced westward, German reconnaissance units used every available vehicle, including hundreds of aging 222s. They served in delaying actions, scouting roads, and harassing Soviet supply lines. In this brutal environment, their weaknesses were laid bare once again. Anti-tank rifles, artillery fragments, even heavy machine gun fire could disable them instantly. Yet crews often stayed in their vehicles until the last possible moment, using the car's agility to retreat just before encirclement. Some 222s were abandoned due to lack of fuel rather than combat damage. The Wehrmacht's supply lines were collapsing, and light vehicles often found themselves stranded. Many were captured intact by advancing Soviet troops, who examined them out of habit, even though they already knew the verdict: fast, clever, but too lightly built for survival. In the last months of the war, a few Sd.Kfz 222s were repurposed for urban defense, their 20mm guns turned into makeshift anti-aircraft mounts atop city ruins. For the soldiers who served in them, the 222 was more than just a reconnaissance car. It was a strange mixture of pride and frustration. It represented the high engineering standards of pre-war Germany, but also the misjudgments of its military planners. It had been designed for short, decisive wars, not for years of attrition. Its very existence told a story about the German mindset in the early 1940s. Confident, precise, and convinced that technology could outthink reality. As Germany's industrial centers came under relentless bombing, production of the Sd.Kfz 222 finally ceased. Spare parts became scarce, and field repairs relied increasingly on cannibalizing damaged vehicles. Crews learned to weld, improvise, and adapt, skills that sometimes kept a car operational months beyond its expected lifespan. It was a testament to both the machine's design and the stubbornness of those who drove it. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, only a few hundred Sd.Kfz 222s were still operational. Many had been destroyed or abandoned, some captured and repainted with Allied or Soviet insignia for use in local security duties. In photographs from the final days of the war, you can still spot them, rusted, dented, but unmistakable. The angular lines of their hulls stood out among wreckage and rubble, silent witnesses to a vanished era of warfare that prized movement over protection. And yet, their story didn't end there. After the war, several nations reused surviving Sd.Kfz 222s in police and border patrol roles. Czechoslovakia, for example, kept a handful in service well into the 1950s, finding them useful for rural patrols. Others found their way into film productions and museums, where they remain today, restored to their original colors, the black crosses replaced by explanations and placards. Visitors often admire their sleek shape, unaware of the lessons written into that thin armor. For engineers, the 222 stands as both a triumph and a warning, a reminder that innovation must always serve reality, not the other way around. In the years following World War II, the Sd.Kfz 222 transitioned from a weapon of war to an artifact of memory. Where once it scouted dusty battlefields and thundered down enemy roads, it now sat in quiet museums or behind military fences, stripped of its ammunition but not its story. Engineers, historians, and even artists came to study it, drawn by its striking geometry and the paradox it represented, a machine that embodied both brilliance and fragility. In Allied archives, the 222's technical drawings were preserved not as trophies but as lessons. At the British School of Tank Technology, its chassis design became a case study in lightweight engineering. Its suspension, remarkably advanced for its time, demonstrated how mobility could be maximized even in compact vehicles. In the United States, the Aberdeen Proving Ground stored several captured examples for decades, occasionally bringing them out for testing new ammunition or demonstrating historical comparisons for engineers. Yet for all its technical sophistication, the Sd.Kfz 222 carried an enduring philosophical weight. Military scholars pointed to it as a symbol of pre-war German confidence, the belief that speed, coordination, and engineering precision could overcome any obstacle. It was, in a sense, the physical embodiment of the blitzkrieg ideal, lean, fast, and sure of itself. But in hindsight, it also revealed how that very confidence became a weakness. When faced with the grinding realities of a long, global conflict, its thin armor and open turret turned from assets into vulnerabilities. By the 1950s and 60s, as new generations of armored vehicles emerged, the 222 was already seen as a relic. Tanks had grown heavier, reconnaissance had become mechanized and air-supported, and communication technologies had advanced far beyond what its simple radio system could handle. Still, the vehicle refused to fade entirely from relevance. Small military forces, especially in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, found use for surviving 222s, refitted with locally made parts or even new engines. For patrol duties and ceremonial parades, they remained surprisingly practical. At the same time, historians began writing the broader story of Germany's war industry, and the Sd.Kfz 222 took its place within that narrative. It wasn't a symbol of terror or destruction like the Tiger tank or the Stuka dive bomber. It was something subtler, the voice of reconnaissance, the eyes of an army that once seemed unstoppable. In war documentaries of the 1970s and 80s, footage of the 222 racing across sand dunes or dusty European roads often appeared in the opening sequences, representing the precision and mobility that had defined early German strategy. Collectors, too, began to rediscover the vehicle. Restoring a 222 was no small task. Many had been stripped of original parts or left in pieces across Europe. But a handful of enthusiasts in Britain, France, and the United States dedicated years to rebuilding them. They tracked down original Hawk V8 engines, reconstructed the conical turret frames, and recreated the delicate mesh shields that once protected gunners from grenades. Some restorations were so faithful that veterans who saw them decades later were momentarily transported back to their youth. When displayed at reenactments or military history shows, the Sd.Kfz 222 often drew crowds. Its design seemed almost futuristic, sharp, geometric, and purposeful. The slanted armor plates reflected light in a way that made the car appear faster even when standing still. Children pointed at it, fascinated by its shape, while older visitors nodded with recognition. For many, it was the first tangible link to stories they'd only heard in books. But among military historians, discussion of the 222 often carried a reflective tone. They admired its craftsmanship yet emphasized what it symbolized about the nature of war's evolution. It was a reminder that every era's perfect weapon eventually meets its limits. The Tu-22 was perfect for 1939, but by 1943, it was outdated. In that shift lay one of the quiet truths of technological progress. Innovation is always temporary. Even decades later, the Sd.Kfz 222 influenced modern vehicle design. Concepts from its engineering, modular armor plates, sloped surfaces for deflection, and all-wheel steering, appeared in later generations of light armored cars and scout vehicles around the world. The principle it embodied, speed and adaptability, remained a cornerstone of military thinking. Only the ratio changed. Where the Germans had sacrificed too much armor for agility, later designers learned to find a better balance. In popular culture, the 222 gained a strange kind of immortality. It appeared in films, television documentaries, and video games, always recognizable by its distinct angular silhouette. In these portrayals, it became more than just a machine. It became a visual shorthand for the early years of the war, when German forces moved swiftly and decisively. In a way, it represented the high tide of that momentum, the point before overreach and exhaustion took hold. And so, as the decades passed, the Sd.Kfz 222 transformed from a symbol of fear to a symbol of fascination. What was once a weapon became a subject of study, and then a piece of shared history. Restored examples gleamed under museum lights, their metallic grey paint now polished, their past reinterpreted. Visitors no longer saw them as instruments of conflict, but as windows into a time when technology and ambition seemed inseparable. Even today, standing before a preserved 222, one can't help but sense both admiration and irony. Its design remains elegant, its proportions balanced, its craftsmanship unmistakable. But the lesson it carries is timeless, that innovation without adaptability leads not to triumph, but to obsolescence. The Sd.Kfz 222 didn't fail because it was poorly made. It failed because the world around it changed faster than it could. In the years that followed its transformation from a battlefield machine into a historical artifact, the Sd.Kfz 222 continued to shape how militaries, engineers, and historians understood the evolution of modern warfare. It was no longer just an old armored car. It was a case study in the eternal balance between speed, protection, and purpose. In many military academies, it became a symbol of design philosophy itself, a reminder that every innovation carries its own blind spots. Post-war military doctrine absorbed these lessons deeply. During the 1950s and 60s, as new nations built their own reconnaissance fleets, they faced the same dilemma that had haunted the 222's creators. How much armor was enough, and how much weight was too much? The French, for example, developed the Panhard EBR, a fast, wheeled scout vehicle that used sloped armor and high mobility, much like the 222 but with a fully enclosed turret. The British Ferret armored car followed the same philosophy, emphasizing protection without sacrificing agility. In each of these machines, one could trace faint echoes of the German design. Even the United States, with its M8 Greyhound and later M114 and M551 Sheridan vehicles, embraced lessons that paralleled the 222's evolution. Designers came to realize that reconnaissance vehicles needed not just speed, but flexibility, communication equipment, modular weapons, and enough armor to survive ambushes. The world had learned from the 222's vulnerability. The emphasis shifted from building vehicles that could see first to those that could see and survive. But the 222's influence went beyond blueprints and doctrines. It shaped thinking about technology itself. Engineers and strategists began to view design not as an end, but as an adaptation to context. The 222 had been perfect for the wars Germany imagined, but not for the wars it actually fought. That mismatch between vision and reality became a warning often repeated in design discussions. Build for the battlefield you will face, not the one you hope for. In this way, the Sd.Kfz 222 became a philosophical object as much as a mechanical one. It symbolized a fundamental truth about progress, that even the most advanced technology must evolve or be left behind. For a post-war world racing into the jet age and the nuclear era, that idea resonated far beyond armored cars. It touched everything from aviation to industrial design, where speed and efficiency often danced uneasily with safety and durability. The 222 also influenced how historians wrote about warfare. In earlier decades, military history had focused mainly on generals, strategies, and battles. But by the 1970s, scholars began to pay attention to machines themselves, their design choices, their production histories, and the people who built and maintained them. The 222 appeared in countless studies as an example of how engineering reflected ideology. Its streamlined shape and minimalist design were seen as expressions of Germany's interwar ambition to combine elegance with dominance. In that sense, it wasn't just a military vehicle, it was a cultural artifact, born from a nation's belief in precision as power. Veterans, too, remembered the Sd.Kfz 222 in complex ways. Some recalled it fondly, as a loyal companion that carried them through impossible terrain. Others viewed it as a fragile shell that offered the illusion of safety. In memoirs, you can find descriptions that sound almost poetic: the hum of the Hawk engine at dawn, the feel of the steering wheel vibrating under gloved hands, the blur of desert wind rushing through the open turret. But always, beneath those memories, there is a quiet acknowledgement of how vulnerable they truly were, and how every mission demanded courage not only from the men but from the machine itself. In post-war Germany, discussions about military technology carried an additional layer of reflection. The Sd.Kfz 222 was often cited as a reminder of the dangers of overconfidence in engineering. German designers, renowned for precision, had produced a marvel of mechanical beauty, but one that faltered when tested by the relentless realities of global conflict. Universities and technical institutes used the 222 in lectures about practical engineering limits, pointing out that even perfection on paper means little if the battlefield rewrites the rules. Meanwhile, in popular culture, the 222 found a second life as an icon of its era. It appeared in post-war newsreels, then in classic war films like The Desert Fox and the Battle of El Alamein. Its presence on screen was immediate and unmistakable: those sharp angles, that low turret, the twin-mesh dome glinting under sunlight. It was cinematic shorthand for the early war years, for speed and confidence before the tide turned. Even in video games decades later, the 222 continued to appear, recreated with such accuracy that players could almost hear the whine of its engine as it darted across virtual sand dunes. What makes the 222's story enduring isn't just its design, but what it says about human ambition. It's the story of a machine built with clarity of purpose that outlived its era because it represented something deeper: the endless human drive to innovate, to refine, and to believe that every problem can be solved through design. And yet, it also serves as a quiet reminder that no matter how advanced our creations become, they are always bound by the realities we fail to predict. That paradox, the brilliance of human invention meeting the humility of circumstance, is what keeps the Sd.Kfz 222 relevant. It's why historians still write about it, why restorers still rebuild it, and why visitors still pause before it in museums. The car doesn't roar anymore, but it still speaks of ingenuity, of limitation, and of the delicate balance between them. Today, when one stands before a restored Sd.Kfz 222, the machine feels almost out of time. Its angular plates, once painted in desert yellow or grey camouflage, now gleam under museum lights. The once roaring Hawk engine is silent, the tyres no longer coated with dust from North Africa or the Eastern Front. Yet the silence is not emptiness, it's reflection. Every bolt, every weld, every angle tells a story of ambition, precision, and the limits of human foresight. Visitors often marvel at its appearance. The 222 looks fast even when stationary, its facete armour glinting like a jewel of industrial design. Many first assume it must have been invincible, a tiny fortress on wheels. But as guides explain that its side armour was just 8 mm thick, the illusion fades. That thin steel, thinner than the width of a coin stack, changes the way people see it. What once seemed like confidence becomes fragility. And that is the essence of its story. Because the Sd.Kfz 222 is not merely a vehicle, it's a metaphor. It represents a moment in history when technology promised safety, and belief in that promise defined how nations went to war. German engineers had trusted math, angles, and metallurgy to protect their crews. Soldiers had trusted those engineers. But the world changed faster than equations could keep up. Rifle bullets hardened, ammunition improved, and suddenly the shield that once seemed solid was no longer enough. This realization carries a timeless echo. The 222 story is not just about World War II, it's about every era in which humans have believed their tools could outpace uncertainty. From airplanes to computers to artificial intelligence, the same cycle repeats. Innovation rises with optimism, then collides with reality. And through that collision, understanding deepens. The Sd.Kfz 222 is the embodiment of that lesson in steel form. For engineers, it remains a study in balance. Its design has achieved extraordinary mechanical harmony, compact weight distribution, efficient power transfer, and all-wheel steering decades ahead of its time. Yet their success in design was matched by a misstep in assumption. They built a Scout for short wars and fast victories, not for a world that would fight for 6 relentless years. In this way, the 222 becomes a symbol of how progress must always adapt, never assume. For historians, it stands as a reminder that war is not only fought by tanks and planes but also by ideas. The 222 was born from the idea that knowledge and speed could conquer the unknown. That belief shaped early German victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans. But once the element of surprise faded, the same design that once symbolized superiority became a liability. The arc of the 222's service mirrors the arc of the war itself: swift ascent, relentless strain, and eventual exhaustion. Even today, the vehicle continues to inspire reflection far beyond military circles. Artists photograph its angular lines as symbols of modernist architecture. Designers study its geometry to understand how function shaped form before computer modeling existed. Writers use it as metaphor, how something that looks strong can be undone by what it was never meant to face. In classrooms, it sparks discussions about how ambition, however brilliant, can sometimes blind its creators. There is also a quiet dignity in how the Sd.Kfz 222 endured. Despite its flaws, it performed the job it was given. It carried crews across deserts, forests, and ruins. It scouted the unknown. It fulfilled the purpose its makers intended, until the world outgrew it. And perhaps that is the final truth of this machine, that perfection in one moment may become imperfection in the next, but what remains is the effort to adapt, to move forward, and to learn. In the end, the Sd.Kfz 222 is not remembered for the battles it won or lost, but for what it revealed. It showed that every machine is a mirror of its makers: clever, hopeful, limited, and deeply human. It showed that strength without flexibility is temporary, and that progress is not a straight line but a constant negotiation between what is possible and what is real. If you listen closely, standing beside one of these preserved vehicles, you can almost hear it whisper its final message. Not the growl of its engine or the crackle of its radio, but something quieter, a reminder that every innovation, no matter how advanced, carries within it the seeds of its own obsolescence. And so, the Sd.Kfz 222 rests, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. A piece of history that outlived its purpose to tell a greater story, that human ingenuity is both our greatest strength and our most delicate illusion.